Hi, and welcome to chapter 11 of The Picture of Dorian Gray. And it's in this chapter that we're really going to be seeing the poisonous influence of the yellow book that Lord Henry has lent Dorian. Time is going to pass, and during this time Dorian's going to get up to more and more, I want to say mischief, but immoral activities as a result of this book. So we're going to see time passing, and it's going to give a lot of details of the influence of the book, and they're really going to be details about sensory pleasures. That line of Lord Henry's about curing the soul by means of the senses. So it's not just dodgy stuff that Dorian's doing. You'll see, music is mentioned, jewelry, but there's also kind of suspect stuff. Dorian disappearing for weekends to dodgy places by the docks. So I'm going to skip a lot of the details about the music and the jewelry and things like that, but hope you get the picture about the poisonous influence of the yellow book. Chapter 11. For years, Dorian Gray could not free himself from the influence of this book. Or perhaps it would be more accurate to say that he never sought or tried to free himself from it. He procured or got from Paris no less than 9 large paper copies of the first edition, and had them bound in different colors so that they might suit his various moods and the changing fancies of a nature over which he seemed at times to have almost entirely lost control. It's a bit about the hero of the yellow book. And the whole book seemed to him, to Dorian, to contain the story of his own life, written before he had lived it. For the wonderful beauty that had so fascinated Basil Hallward, and many others besides him, seemed never to leave him. Dorian stays looking young and good-looking. Even those who had heard the most evil things against him, of course that's implying there are people who've heard very evil things against him. And from time to time strange rumors about his mode of life crept through London and became the chatter of the clubs, the whiskey and fireplace and newspaper clubs. Even such people could not believe anything to his dishonor when they saw him. He had always the look of one who had kept himself unspotted from the world. He still looks innocent and untouched, and we know that's not true, so a big theme here is appearance versus reality. Men who talked grossly, men who saw while they talked, became silent when Dorian Gray entered the room. His mere presence seemed to recall to them the memory of the innocence that they had tarnished. They wondered how one so charming and graceful as he was could have escaped the stain of an age that was at once sordid and sensual. Here's the dodgy disappearances. Often, on returning home from one of those mysterious and prolonged absences that gave rise to such strange conjecture, strange theories, guesses among those who were his friends, or thought that they were so, he himself would creep upstairs to the locked room, open the door with the key that never left him now, and stand with a mirror in front of the portrait that Basil Hallward had painted of him, looking now at the evil and aging face on the canvas, and now at the fair young face that laughed back at him from the polished glass. So he sees the changes on the painting and looks at his own face in the mirror, which looks as innocent as ever. He would examine with minute care, and sometimes with a monstrous and terrible delight, the hideous lines that seared or burnt the wrinkling forehead on the painting, or crawled around the heavy sensual mouth, wondering sometimes which were the more horrible, the signs of sin or the signs of age. There were moments indeed at night when, lying sleepless in his own delicately scented chamber, or in the sordid room of the little ill-famed tavern near the docks, which under an assumed name and in disguise it was his habit to frequent, he would think of the ruin he had brought upon his soul, with a pity that was all the more poignant because it was purely selfish. But moments such as these were rare. That curiosity about life which Lord Henry had first stirred in him as they sat together in the garden of their friend seemed to increase with gratification. The more he knew, the more he desired to know. He had mad hungers that grew more ravenous as he fed them. And you can interpret that as you like, but that's sensory hungers, stuff that he has to do. So he still has this life in society, and I'm skipping all this. And fashion, I see there's the word dandyism. He likes dressing up for the balls, the parties, the dances. There are the five senses. Of course, he's living this life of hedonism, this life of sensual pleasure. But it appeared to Dorian Gray that the true nature of the senses had never been understood, and that they had remained savage and animal merely because the world had sought to starve them into submission or to kill them by pain, instead of aiming at making them elements of a new spirituality, of which a fine instinct for beauty was to be the dominant characteristic. So there's a bit of aesthetics coming in there again. There's that word hedonism that Lord Henry prophesied that was going to recreate life. And of course, it all comes back to that line of Lord Henry's about nothing can cure the soul but the senses, just as nothing can cure the senses but the soul. And I think we're going to start now with some of the sensory pleasures that Dorian takes. I see religion in that one. Here's perfumes. Here's the music one. At another time, he devoted himself entirely to music and listens to the strange stuff. There's gypsies, tall wild music from little zithers, or grave yellow-shawled Tunisians plucked at the strained strings of monstrous lutes, while grinning Negroes beat monotonously upon copper drums, and crouching upon scarlet mats, slim turbaned Indians blew through long pipes of reed or brass, and charmed, or feigned to charm, pretended to charm, great hooded snakes and horrible horned adders. Not listening to what everyone else in England is listening to some extreme avant-garde musicians, it sounds like. And there's the bit about the study of jewels, but I'm skipping all of that. There's embroideries. He was almost saddened by the reflection of the ruin that time brought on beautiful and wonderful things. I guess embroideries themselves, but of course also people. But he stays young. No winter marred his face, no winter spoiled his face, or stained his flower-like bloom. For these treasures, and this is why he does all this, and everything that he collected in his lovely house were to be to him means of forgetfulness, modes by which he could escape for a season from the fear that seemed to him at times to be almost too great to be borne. This makes me think of Macbeth getting everything that he wanted and still living in stress and tension. And yeah, so he still has this fear, and it's this life of sensory pleasure that helps him to forget his fear. After a few years, he could not endure to be long out of England. He hated to be separated from the picture that was such a part of his life, and was also afraid that during his absence, someone might gain access to the room, in spite of the elaborate bars that he had caused to be placed upon the door. He was quite conscious that this would tell them nothing, It was true that the portrait still preserved, under all the foulness and ugliness of the face, its marked likeness to himself. But what could they learn from that? Yet he was afraid. Sometimes when he was down at his great house in Nottinghamshire, entertaining the fashionable young men of his own rank who were his chief companions, and astounding the country by the wanton luxury and gorgeous splendor of his mode of life, he would suddenly leave his guests and rush back to town to see that the door had not been tampered with and that the picture was still there. What if it should be stolen? The mere thought made him cold with horror. Surely the world would know his secret then. Perhaps the world already suspected it. For, while he fascinated many, there were not a few who distrusted him. He was very nearly blackballed or kind of chucked out at a West End club, of which his birth and social position fully entitled him to become a member. And it was said that on one occasion, when he was brought by a friend into the smoking room of the Churchill, the Duke of Berwick and another gentleman got up in a marked manner and went out. So there's already bad enough stories about him that when he walks in a room, some people want to walk out. Curious stories. So we're not going to get many details here, but we've got to read into these lines. Curious stories became current about him after he had passed his 25th year. It was rumored that he'd been seen brawling with foreign sailors in a low den in the distant parts of Whitechapel, and that he consorted or hung around with thieves and coiners and knew the mysteries of their trade. His extraordinary absences became notorious, and when he used to reappear again in society, men would whisper to each other in corners, or pass him with a sneer, or look at him with cold, searching eyes, as though they were determined to discover his secret. And long skip here, see? I saw the word orgies there. I can't tell you what orgies those are. I guess back to the novel, to the Yellow Book again, and a chapter that he read more than once, and what it was about, and I've skipped it. There was a horrible fascination in them all. Dorian Gray had been poisoned by a book. There were moments when he looked on evil simply as a mode through which he could realize his conception of the beautiful. So yes, chapter 11's really just been about the Yellow Book and its hedonistic influence on Dorian Gray. We'll see you again in chapter 12.